The folder was thicker than I expected. 43 pages of legal transfers, LLC registrations, and property documents, all tabbed with little yellow sticky arrows that pointed to the lines where I was supposed to sign. My husband sat beside me at the conference table, his hand resting on my knee, warm and familiar, and the notary across from us smiled the polished smile of someone who'd witnessed 1,000 signatures in this room and never once asked if any of them were mistakes. I was about to hand over my mother's bakery, not to a stranger, to an LLC my husband had created 6 weeks after her funeral, a shell company with a name that sounded almost real, Cornerstone Bakery Holdings, LLC, and an address that turned out to be a UPS store on the outskirts of Memphis when I finally thought to look it up. But I didn't know that yet, not in that conference room, not with his hand on my knee and the notary's pen hovering and all 43 pages waiting for me. What I knew was that my mother had built Sweet Clara's from nothing. 22 years of 4:30 morning shifts and flour under her fingernails, and a customer list that stretched back to when this part of Nashville was still mostly farmland. She'd left it to me. She'd left everything to me because I was all she had, and I was 29 years old and still learning how to grieve. And I had signed a power of attorney 14 months ago on the third date with the man who said he could help me carry it. My phone buzzed under the table. I almost ignored it. My husband had asked me twice that morning to leave it in the car. "This is a big day for us," he'd said. "Let's be present." But some reflex deeper than manners, made me flip it over and glance at the screen. Unknown number. 5 words. "Don't sign anything. Walk out now." I looked up. The notary was still smiling. My husband was studying the documents, one finger tracing the line beside the first yellow arrow. He hadn't seen the message. I pressed the phone face down against my thigh and said very calmly that I needed to use the restroom. I'd met my husband at the grief support group that met Tuesday evenings in the basement of Calvary Baptist on Gallatin Pike. It was November, 6 weeks after my mother's diagnosis became a prognosis. Became a phone call I answered in a hospital parking garage while it rained. He was sitting 3 chairs to my left, and when they went around the circle and asked everyone to share, he said he'd lost his father to a long illness, that he understood the particular exhaustion of watching someone leave slowly. And I felt something unlock in my chest that had been sealed shut since September. His name, he told me, was Daniel. He was 38, gray at the temples in a way that looked earned rather than premature. He said he worked in commercial real estate development. He said he'd grown up in Atlanta but had moved to Nashville 4 years ago for a fresh start after a difficult divorce. No children, no bad blood. Just 2 people who'd grown into different people, he said. He said it the way people say things when they've rehearsed the explanation enough times that the edges go smooth. I was a pediatric nurse at Vanderbilt. I had my mother's house, her bakery, and a savings account that a financial advisor would have called modest, and a predator would have called a start. I didn't know which kind of man Daniel was. I thought I was being careful. I waited 4 months before I let him help me with anything. 5 months before I let him see my mother's files. We were married in April, 8 months after the grief group. Small ceremony, just a few colleagues from the hospital and Daniel's business partner. A quiet man named Phil who shook my hand and said Daniel had talked about me constantly. My best friend stood beside me and whispered that I seemed happy, and I was, or I believed I was, which felt close enough at the time. The trouble with grief is that it softens your edges. It makes you want to believe that something good has arrived to balance the accounting. I wanted Daniel to be the good thing. So when he started talking about consolidating my mother's assets into a holding company for tax purposes, when he started explaining how probate worked and what I stood to lose in estate fees if I didn't act strategically, I listened. He used words like protection and legacy and what your mother would have wanted, and I signed things without reading them because I trusted him and because I was tired and because the fog in my brain that had started around March made everything feel like reading through frosted glass. I didn't understand the fog yet. Not then. The hallway outside the restrooms in the law office was narrow and smelled of carpet cleaner. I stood with my back against the wall and typed back to the unknown number. "Who is this?" The reply came in under 10 seconds. Margaret Holloway, your mother's business partner for 11 years. I've been trying to reach you for 6 weeks. He blocked my number from your phone. Please come outside. I'm in the gray Accord across the street. My legs went strange beneath me. My mother had mentioned Margaret 100 times, the woman who'd handled the wholesale accounts, who'd driven with her to the suppliers in Murfreesboro every other Thursday, who'd been at my mother's bedside the last week and had wept at the funeral in the 3rd row while I sat in the 1st row feeling nothing, because feeling nothing was all I could manage. I had tried to call Margaret after the funeral. The number went to voicemail. I left 2 messages. She never called back, and eventually I assumed she was grieving in her own way, and I stopped trying. He blocked her number from my phone. I walked back through the conference room, picked up my purse from the back of the chair, and said I was feeling sick. My husband stood immediately, concerned and attentive, his hand on my elbow. "Let me come with you." I told him no, that I just needed air, that I'd be right back, that he should wait. I said it lightly, the way you say things when you've learned that light tones don't trigger questions. He had taught me that too, without meaning to. I walked out of the building and across the street and got into the gray Accord. Margaret Holloway was 61, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the bearing of a woman who had spent 2 decades managing a small business and was not easily shaken. She was shaken now. Her hands on the steering wheel were white-knuckled, and when she turned to look at me, her eyes were wet. She said she had found out about Daniel 6 weeks ago, when she tried to transfer the wholesale supplier contracts back to Sweet Clara's and discovered the business had already been moved into a holding company she'd never heard of. She'd called the number on the LLC registration and reached a voicemail that said Cornerstone Holdings, leave a message. She'd hired a small firm to run a background check. What they found had taken 2 weeks to untangle. Daniel's real name was not Daniel. He had been born Derek Allen Moss in Knoxville in 1984. He had 2 prior marriages, not one. The first ended when his wife in Charlotte discovered he'd forged her signature on a home equity loan. The case had been filed as a civil matter. The second wife, a recently widowed woman in Raleigh who'd inherited her husband's construction company, had lost the entire business and $1,340,000 in personal savings before Derek disappeared in the middle of the night. She'd gone to the police. They'd told her she'd signed the documents voluntarily. The case sat in a civil court for 3 years while Derek became Daniel and moved to Nashville and started attending Tuesday grief groups. I sat in the passenger seat of Margaret's car and watched the door to the law office across the street and felt the world rearrange itself around me. I said, he told me his divorce was amicable. Margaret said, there was no divorce. His second wife is still legally married to a man who doesn't exist under that name. I said, I've been foggy for months. I thought it was grief. Margaret turned to look at me very carefully. She asked what medications I was taking. I told her just the anxiety prescription my doctor had written in February, the one Daniel had offered to pick up for me because the pharmacy was on his way to the office. Margaret said, show me the bottle. The pills in my prescription bottle were the right color and the right shape. They had the right manufacturer's name printed on the side. But when Margaret photographed them and sent the image to a pharmacist friend in Brentwood, the friend called back within an hour and said the imprint code was wrong. The code on the pills didn't match the medication on the label. It matched a different drug, a mild sedative used for sleep, commonly available, nothing that would show up alarming on a standard checkup, enough to slow your thinking, enough to make complex paperwork feel overwhelming and signing whatever was put in front of you feel like the path of least resistance. He had been replacing my anxiety medication with sedatives for 8 months. I sat in Margaret's car and stared at the bottle in my hands and thought about every morning since March when I'd taken what I believed was my medication with a glass of orange juice my husband had poured for me, and how kind that had seemed, how caring, how utterly ordinary. The women in the grief group always said that grief made you vulnerable. I had nodded along because it sounded true. I had not understood what it meant to have someone study that vulnerability like a blueprint. I put the bottle in my purse. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, and I told Margaret I needed her help. She drove me to a legal aid clinic on Charlotte Avenue where a young attorney named Reyes worked late on Thursdays. He was 32 and methodical, the kind of lawyer who listened without interrupting and wrote everything down in small, neat handwriting. And when I finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment, and then said, "We can do this, but we have to do it right." He laid out what we had and what we needed. What we had? Photographs of the counterfeit pills, the LLC registration documents showing the transfer of Sweet Clara's, Margaret's testimony about the attempted contract theft, and 6 weeks of emails between Daniel and an associate named Terry that Margaret's investigator had flagged during the background check, emails in which they discussed the timeline for moving the business assets offshore before the wife figures out the picture, his words. What we needed, Daniel, in the act of completing the fraud. The closing hadn't happened. I hadn't signed. If we went to the police tonight, his lawyers would call it a misunderstanding between spouses. He'd claim he was managing assets I'd asked him to manage. The sedative swap would be harder to prove without a full toxicology workup, which would take time and which Daniel's lawyers would call circumstantial. What we needed was him on record, completing the wire transfer. Reyes called a contact at the Nashville field office of the FBI. The agent called back 40 minutes later. She said, "We know about Derek Moss. We've been building a case for 14 months. We've been looking for the current wife." She said, "You're the current wife." She said, "You're the current wife." She said, "We need 48 hours." I drove back to my house, our house, the house Daniel had moved into 18 months ago with 2 suitcases and a framed photograph of his supposed father that I now understood was a stock image. And I unlocked the door and went inside. He was in the kitchen making dinner. He looked up when I came in and smiled and asked if the signing had gone okay, if everything was sorted. I said yes. Just a small snag with the notary schedule. We'd have to go back Monday. He said that was fine. He handed me a glass of water. I thanked him and poured it down the sink when he turned back to the stove. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. I had worn the same clothes to bed for 2 nights rather than go through the closet where I'd found, the previous Thursday, a prepaid phone taped behind a loose panel in the baseboard. I had put it back exactly where I found it. I had not told Daniel I found it. The FBI agent said, "Don't disturb anything. Don't let him know the timeline has changed. Be the version of yourself he expects." The version of myself he expected was agreeable and slightly confused, and deeply, quietly grateful to have someone managing the complicated parts of her life. I had been performing that version for 8 months without understanding I was performing it, because the sedatives had made the performance feel like reality. Now I was performing it consciously, and every nod and smile and, of course, whatever you think is best carved out a small hollow piece of me. But I thought about the second wife in Raleigh. I thought about the construction company that was gone. I thought about the business my mother had built at 4:30 in the morning for 22 years, and I held the hollow pieces together with that. On Saturday afternoon, Daniel took a call in the backyard. Through the kitchen window, I watched him pace the length of the fence, speaking quickly, his free hand cutting the air in short, sharp gestures. His business partner, Terry, I assumed, running the timeline. The closing was rescheduled for Monday at 10. I texted the FBI agent he's confirming with his associate. On track. She texted back, "Good. Stay the course. We'll be in position by 9 a.m. On Sunday morning, Daniel made pancakes and we ate together at the kitchen table, and he told me about a property deal he was closing next quarter in Memphis. Something about waterfront development, and I said that sounded exciting. And he reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said, "Once this bakery situation is sorted, we're going to take that trip to Portugal you've been wanting. I promise." I said, "I can't wait." He had no idea that the phone in my hand under the table had just sent a recording of that conversation to the FBI agent's secure line. Monday morning, the same conference room, the same notary, the same 43 pages with the same yellow arrows. Terry was there this time, seated across the table in a charcoal blazer, silver-haired and smooth, the kind of man who had spent decades making fraud look like financial planning. He shook my hand and introduced himself as the firm's senior wealth manager and said he was glad we could reschedule. I sat down. Daniel sat beside me. The notary arranged the pages. I thought about my mother driving to Murfreesboro at 6 in the morning with Margaret beside her in the passenger seat, talking about wholesale flower prices and laughing about something I'd never know. I thought about the name she had painted on the bakery window, Sweet Clara's, in the same looping script she'd used on birthday cards my whole life. I thought about how she had worked her whole life to leave me something solid, and about the man sitting next to me who had watched her bury her and started planning the same week. The notary slid the first page toward me. I picked up the pen, and then, exactly as Reyes had instructed, I added 4 words in the margin beneath the signature line, signed under legal advisement, CMH. My initials, a flag for the prosecutor, a breadcrumb that said, I was here, I was conscious, I was not the person they thought I was. Terry gathered the signed pages. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose, the sound of relief, the sound of a man who thinks he's won. The notary stepped out to notarize the copies. Daniel turned to me and said, "Thank you for trusting me with this." I looked at him. I said, "I want to ask you something." He said, "Of course." I said, "What's the name of the first woman you did this to?" The room went very still. He laughed. Short and sharp, a reflex. Then he studied my face and the laugh stopped. I said, "I know your real name. I know about the woman in Raleigh. I know about the counterfeit pills. I know about the prepaid phone in the baseboard. And I know that the FBI has been in this building since 9 o'clock this morning." The color left his face so completely and so fast that it looked like a faucet being shut off. He started to stand. The conference room door opened. 3 federal agents. And behind them, the FBI agent whose voice I'd heard on the phone for 48 hours but was meeting now in person for the first time. She was small and precise and entirely calm, and she looked at my husband and said his real name, Derek Allen Moss, and told him he was under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and administering a controlled substance without consent. Derek, looked at me. His expression moved through several things quickly. Shock, calculation, then something uglier, something that had been underneath the whole time. He said, "You signed everything. You're going to look like the willing party." I said, "No, because I'd been recording you since Saturday afternoon. And because the notary in this room works for the FBI, the agents had him in handcuffs before he reached the door. Thierry was arrested in the parking lot. He cooperated by noon. The indictment came down 6 weeks later. 31 counts, wire fraud across 3 states, identity theft under 4 aliases, conspiracy with Terry to defraud, unlawful administration of a controlled substance. The Raleigh wife, a woman named Donna, 54 years old, who had rebuilt her life after Derek's disappearance by working nights as a contractor's bookkeeper, agreed immediately to testify. She said she'd been waiting 3 years for someone to call. She said, "Every month I check his name in the court filings. Every month, nothing." I was starting to think I'd imagined it. I had not imagined it. Neither had she. The trial lasted 9 days. Donna took the stand on day 2 and described the construction company her late husband had built over 25 years, how Derek had moved into her house 4 months after her husband died, how he'd explained the power of attorney as estate planning, how she'd woken up one Thursday to an empty house and a zero balance in 4 accounts. She said the police had called it a civil dispute. She said the word civil had felt like a slap across the face. On day 4, the FBI forensic accountant walked the jury through the offshore trail, an LLC in Delaware feeding into an account in the Cayman Islands, the same routing structure Derek had used in Raleigh, updated with new shell company names and a new notary accomplice, Terry, who testified for the prosecution under his cooperation agreement and confirmed the profit split, the planning emails, the deliberate timeline built around my mother's probate. On day 5, a pharmacist from Vanderbilt Medical Center testified about the counterfeit pills. She had full toxicology results by then. The pills in my prescription bottle had contained 0.5 milligrams of a generic sedative, subtherapeutic in isolation, cumulative over 8 months of daily dosing. She used the clinical language, cognitive blunting, reduced executive function, decreased resistance to suggestion, and then she looked at the jury and translated it. The defendant had been chemically reducing the victim's ability to think critically about the documents she was asked to sign. It was, she said, one of the more methodical cases she had seen. Several jurors looked at Derek when she said that. He stared at the table. I testified on day 6. I walked the jury through the morning of the second closing attempt, the text from Margaret, the hour in the car, the 48 hours of performing normalcy, while the FBI built their position. I read the transcript of the Saturday recording aloud. When I got to the part where Derek said, "Once this bakery situation is sorted, we're going to take that trip to Portugal," said it while the transfer of my mother's business was 48 hours from completion, 2 women in the jury box looked at each other. The prosecutor played the arrest footage on day 7. The jury watched Derek go still when I said his real name. They heard his voice, flat and cold, telling me I was going to look like the willing party. They heard me tell him about the notary. Donna was in the gallery. When the footage ended, she exhaled so loudly that the judge looked up. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On a Tuesday afternoon in the fall, they returned on all 31 counts. Guilty. The judge sentenced Derek Allen Moss to 28 years in federal prison. Terry received 11 years under the cooperation agreement. The offshore accounts were frozen pending restitution. Donna and I would each recover a portion. Sweet Clara's was returned to my name the same afternoon. I stood outside the courthouse with Margaret and Donna in the November cold, and none of us said anything for a long time. Margaret put her arm around my shoulders. Donna pulled her coat tighter and looked up at the sky the way you look when you're finally putting something down that you've been carrying alone. She said, "Your mother would have liked that outcome." I said, "She really would have." 8 months later, I stood in the kitchen of Sweet Clara's at 4:30 in the morning and turned on the oven. Margaret was at the prep table measuring flour. We had brought in a new overnight baker named Rosa, who had been running a catering operation out of her apartment and needed a real kitchen. And the 3 of us worked in the comfortable quiet of people who understand each other without much conversation. The coffee was on. The lights above the display cases were warm. Outside, Nashville was still dark, and the sign in the window glowed the same way it had for 22 years. I had moved back into my mother's house. I had taken the framed stock photo of Derek's father to the dumpster in the alley behind the bakery, and I had felt nothing except a mild relief at putting it down. I had found a psychiatrist who helped me understand what 8 months of cognitive interference does to a person's sense of reality and what recovery from that looks like, which is slower and less linear than you'd expect, but more possible than you fear. I had also, 3 months earlier, started doing something that had surprised me. I started taking calls. The first one came through the bakery's Instagram DM. A woman in Chattanooga, 32 years old, a teacher who had recently inherited her father's small trucking company. She said her new fiancé was pushing her to sign the business into a joint holding company and that something felt wrong, but she couldn't identify what. She said she'd found our case in a local news article. She asked if I had any advice. I called her back. I walked her through exactly what to look for. I gave her Ray's number and the FBI agent's direct line. 3 weeks later, she sent me a message that said, "You were right. It was all wrong. The FBI is involved. I'm safe. Thank you." After that, they came steadily. Not a flood, but a current. Women who had found something in the news coverage. Women who'd heard from a friend of a friend. Women who were somewhere in the middle of a story that felt familiar and wrong and who needed someone to say, "You're not imagining it, and here is what to do." I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't an investigator. I was a pediatric nurse who had learned at significant cost exactly how this particular kind of predator operates. I knew the language they used. I knew the sequence. I knew which documents to photograph and which phones to check and what the fog felt like from the inside and how long it takes to clear. Donna drove up from Raleigh in March and helped me put together a basic resource page on a website Reyes helped me register. Margaret handled the social accounts. Donna wrote most of the content because she had been building it in her head for 3 years. And it came out quickly and cleanly the way things do when they've been waiting a long time to exist. We called it the Flour and the Fire Project, after the bakery, after the idea that something useful can come from being put through enough heat. By fall, we had documented 62 cases, connected 41 women with legal representation, and helped initiate 7 federal investigations. One evening in October, I was locking up the bakery and my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. "My name is Susan. I'm in Phoenix. I just found a second passport in my husband's car with a different name. I don't know what to do. I saw your website. Please help." I sat down on the step outside the bakery door and typed back immediately. "Susan, you did the right thing by reaching out. First, don't say anything to him tonight. You're safe for now. Here's my number. Call me when you can speak privately." I looked up at the bakery window, at the name painted in my mother's looping hand, lit from inside and warm against the October dark. She had worked 22 years to leave me something solid. I was going to make sure it lasted. I waited for Susan to call. "Before I go, I want to say something directly to you, if you've been watching from a place of recognition. If something in this story felt familiar, if the fog felt familiar, if the language felt familiar, trust that feeling. The women in our community hear it over and over. I thought I was imagining it. I thought I was being dramatic. He seems so caring. That's the design. The care is the mechanism, not the exception to it. Real love does not require you to sign things you haven't read. Real love does not manage your medication. Real love does not redirect the phone calls at the people who knew you before. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, and tell me if there's a moment in your own life where someone's voice cut through the noise and changed everything. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications. These stories exist because someone needs to hear them. That someone might be you. It might be the woman watching beside you. It might be someone who hasn't found us yet. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next one.